I want us to become brothers again like we used to be, and for us to find ourselves and bond with each other. Can we agree to that?
Opinions vary.
Welcome to Three Brothers Filmcast. Now, on November 5th, earlier this year, Donald Shebib, the great Canadian director, passed away. And I'm not sure a lot of Canadians really understand the full impact that Shebib had on the industry. In 1970, he made probably the first great English language Canadian film called Going Down the Road about two down on their luck Maritimers who come to Toronto in search of dreams and fun on Yonge Street and kind of have their dreams slashed in the kind of blue collar reality of what Toronto was.
I sure hope we're doing the right thing, that's all.
Oh, for Christ's sake, Joey. I told you my aunt and uncle had put us up. And Hudson said he'd get us a job, so what are you worrying about?
You know, I heard they were taking on guys at the cannery next week, just when we leave.
The cannery? Christ, Joey. I'm not working in any more canneries. That's why we left. You'd be working for $1.25 an hour the rest of your life.
I just keep on thinking about Jerry, Mertz, and Freddie. They didn't do too good. They were back in 3 months.
3 dummies. I don't get you. When we were leaving, you couldn't get out of the place fast enough. Now you go on about some job in a cannery. Oh, listen, Joey. It's gonna be so different. There you can get all kinds of jobs. Not just sweating dirt all the time. And the places you go, we're gonna hit some night spots, have us some good times. No more sitting in some restaurant all night, or driving up and down Main Street looking for something you know damn well ain't there. Oh, Joey, there's gonna be so much there. We won't know where to begin.
I just thought it was a good opportunity now for us to shed some light on this kind of criminally underseen movie that's very significant within Canadian cinematic history. But saying the phrase Canadian cinematic history is like a bracket within a bracket within a bracket. Like it's such a narrow amount of people who are actually invested in this kind of stuff. And so, Anton, I know you caught up with this movie recently for the first time. So I'm just curious, like completely blank, like just knowing the little bits that you knew about Going Down the Road, what did you think of it actually watching it?
I love the movie. I thought it was great. And I think the description of it as this important Canadian film does sort of bracket it off from not only its significance, but also how enjoyable the movie is and how much we should just think of this as like another great 1970s sort of realist drama, but from a distinctly Canadian focus. So what I would say is like, a lot of these, I haven't seen any of Shebib's other films. And I really came to this movie only on your recommendation recently. And I'm really glad I found it. I want to go seek out more of his stuff. And I found it had a really captivating story. The way it's shot, like it's so, you can tell like it's low budget, it's raw, but it has a richness of character. The interactions feel real. And for me, like, I think on the sort of the Canadian side, like the movie captures something that is kind of a Canadian experience, but I think it captures it in a way that would be understandable to anyone, and you sort of begin to understand this experience, even as an outsider. So Toronto being the central city in Canada, and coming from another place and moving to Toronto and trying to sort of establish yourself there is such. It's something that so many Canadians have done, like I personally have done, and I could just sort of see myself in these characters. Back when I first, like my very first year in Toronto, where you're just, in whatever apartment and you're just trying to find whatever job, and you're kind of excited because you're in the big city now, and moving from Saskatchewan, one of the sort of further provinces, because Canada is a regionalized and, provincial country, but it does have, Toronto is one of these major metros that pulls people in. But then it's not, the city is not what you might think it is. But the way then it explores the ups and downs that these characters experience there, it reminded me of like these, the sort of the kitchen sink dramas, like the UK from like a decade earlier, and just portrayal of kind of like blue collar life was just like really rich and focused and valuable.
Yeah, not condescending. So prior to making Going Down the Road,
Yeah.
Shebib was a documentarian.
Oh, okay.
This
Yeah.
was his first feature film, his first fiction film, but he had made several like smaller projects, documentaries for like NFB and like CBC and stuff. And
So that's the
kind of
National Film Board of Canada.
yeah.
Yeah.
And so kind of his hallmark of his filmmaking style and documentaries was like not condescending to the material. So he would make films about like subject matter that sometimes would like piss people off, but he just kind of would just follow the people because he just thought they were interesting and wouldn't really judge them in the process. So he has this one, I forget what it's called. It's like I don't think it's even available, but it's like a film about a street preacher in Toronto. And he's just like following why this guy does this, what he does, and basically investigating his like extreme faith that leads him to go out on the street corner and like yell at people. But he's weirdly like sympathetic to the guy and his kind of belief in this dream that nobody else sees. And you can see that in Going Down the Road, following Pete and Joey, these two lovable idiots, honestly, and different kind of idiots. Like Joey is clearly like delusional. Pete is more full and more put together, but more like probably egotistical about who he thinks he is. Like the great scene where Pete goes in, he's like, "Oh, Joey, don't you see? There's jobs you can get in advertising. I could go make commercials." And then he goes in, and the guy who's like, "What in the world did you think you could ever come in here? This job requires a commercial university degree and this, that, and the other." He's
Let
like,
alone a high school.
Yeah.
Whatever possessed you to come here looking for a job? There's nothing in your background to suggest even an interest in advertising.
Oh, wow. Well, you know, I used to watch a lot of commercials down home on the TV. I mean, I really enjoyed them. You know, like some of those car commercials. Hey, when GTO comes over the hill and it shoots across the desert. Oh, I like that.
Excuse me.
Like, and he's earnest about it. It's like such a ridiculous scene, but that is a scene that captures like a level of pathos that is just so hard to get correctly. And because the two actors, Doug McGrath as Pete and Paul Bradley as Joey, so at the time in 1969 when Donald Shebib was casting, they were all in the kind of Toronto method group, and they're all cast in this play together with like Jane Eastwood, who ended up on SCTV. All three of them. They were all in the same group, and they were all performing. And Donald Shebib got some like a recommendation from somebody being like, "Hey, you should get these folks to come out. They have kind of a very raw style that might work with your budget level. They haven't done any movies, but they're really good, like promising theatrical actors." And he auditioned them, and he ended up casting like most of them in the movie. And that naturalism lends over. And so I think for like an American audience, the most maybe pertinent connection would be like a John Cassavetes.
Yeah.
It's that idea of like improvisation within the confines of a very strict dramatic structure, but using like method performance and docudrama improvisation to get at something really true in the moment. And so that's the way that he filmed this movie. It was like a very small budget at people who
and the shots seem like fly on the wall type, like
they are.
But
the thing that people you might not understand if you're listening to this, and you especially if you're not from Canada, but like there was no such thing as a Toronto film industry when this movie was made. There was television filmed in Toronto, there was documentary, but it was like very localized, very regional.
At this time, really the only film would have been out of Quebec, right?
Quebec. All the actual feature films are out of Quebec at this time. And so you make a comment being like, okay, so you mean it's Going Down the Road is kind of filmed like a Jean-Luc Godard, where he like didn't ask for permission to film. It's like, well, yeah, Shebib doesn't ask for permission. Oh, so like he just skirted around the permits. It's like, no, there were no permits. You couldn't get permits because there was no like Toronto Film Office. Like it is the kind of thing like people. It's not that it was difficult to make movies, that people did not make movies in Toronto at this moment. And so for Canadian audiences to see this movie on the screen was like honestly like a revelatory experience, because it was the first time watching the city and the country reflected back on them as it exists in their own life. And it was like, wow, I'm watching Toronto play Toronto, and I'm watching these people that seem like folks that I come across when I walk down a young street and might actually see a bit of myself in the idea of like, I moved to Toronto to follow my dreams and like, that kind of
Yeah.
thing. And like, so people back in the early 70s when this movie came out were like the Canadian set was like floored by this movie, but the movie's outsized critical acclaim within Canada, and it's the thing that like people like Piers Handling, who was like the first CEO of TIFF and things like that, had latched onto and talked about this movie as such a seminal moment, almost cursed it because Canada has a tall poppies thing, right? Like the second something you grow too high, we chop you down.
Yeah.
Like that's a thing in Canada. You're not allowed to succeed. You have to be mediocre in Canada. We love mediocrity. We don't love greatness. And this movie was like the first instance of Canadian cinema kind of English language cinema kind of reaching for greatness and actually achieving it. And so if you look at like the American reviews, the movie doesn't have as much raves. Some of them are like, oh, this is like an interesting kind of kitchen sink drama, as you say. Some of the Europeans and Brits were like a little more skeptical. Notably, somebody who loved it was Roger Ebert.
Oh, really?
4 stars, raved about it.
Wow.
As being like one of the most authentic movies he had seen that year. But it's just, if you're not Canadian, I don't think you understand how important this movie is in like setting a template for like serious Canadian filmmaking. But then when you watch saying all that undersells that this is like a funny movie, enjoyable movie. And it's got a Bruce Cockburn score that was controversially never released on actual like record.
Oh,
despite
really?
Donald Shebib being so angry that Bruce Cockburn would never leverage his fame and actually put this on the record, which would make the movie way more popular because people like, I want to seek the movie. But Cockburn had never done an actual score for a movie before. So he was like, I'm not comfortable putting like the Going Down the Road song on one of my albums because this is just for the movie. And he's like, if you put it on one of your albums, it'll become a top hit. And then people will be like, I got to watch the movie.
Yeah. Wow. No, but I think even for a Canadian audience, it's hard for us to conceive of like Toronto not being a center of film because like the Toronto Film Festival for so long, right? It like has been,
and we film how many
TIFF
like
is such
TV
a
shows,
important
right?
What?
And movies here. We film so many
and then
TV shows,
since
so
what,
many
the
movies.
90s, so much American TV shot in Toronto.
And like people like remember like this movie it's pre-Cronenberg, it's pre-Adam McGowan, it's pre-Ivan Reitman. Like it's before you even get into the tax shelter era where you can kind of like eke out either like a teen sex comedy or like a gross horror movie. It's before all that.
Yeah. The score is really good. And the opening, so the opening of the movie showing like rural Cape Breton. So Cape Breton's like the island off of or is it peninsula? I can't remember.
No, it's not. Yeah, off of Nova Scotia. Yeah.
Off of Nova Scotia. Sort of a coal mining territory, and like the way it shows like that setting, you're like, wow, like you can really see the documentary side of this filmmaking. And it's rare for you to get that like that raw look of how hard just like regular life in 1970 in like, outside the cities in Canada things could be.
It reminded me
and he explains the whole motivation of like we got to get out of here.
Yeah, we got to go down the road to find a better life that we've dreamed about. That like we can get a job here in the fish packing plant or whatever, but like it's not there's no future for us here. And the scenes, it's funny because it's entirely montage. It's a wordless montage essentially, right? So it's like Joey bidding farewell to his mother, but we see his mother, we don't hear her. They get in his Impala with the flames
all painted up.
And it has My Nova Scotia Home painted on it as well. And he hits the road and we're going to Toronto. And then when they're driving to Toronto, they're coming down the Don Valley Parkway and Pete's like so excited being like, oh, like we got jobs lined up for here. There's a place of like promise. And then they yell out like, lock up your daughters. Like this idea, like these two virile young men with a future are coming in. And it's like, we're going to like take over the town. And almost immediately are like brought down to earth.
Yeah. That moment, like when they're, like they go to the city with the promise that they're going to stay with, is it his cousin or uncle?
his aunt and uncle.
Yeah, and they just won't answer the door, and there's
They're like
and
hiding
again,
behind.
but the economical like way that scene is done, they're just knocking on the door, and then you get the inside, and they're like talking, and they're like, "It's been 5 minutes." Most people would just take a hint, like, and leave, and like they just, in some ways, because it underplays that moment, it's like more powerful because you're just like, oh man, that's like so brutal that like, I don't know if you don't get a sense of whether they actually talked. Was he just making up this connection? But either way, you're like the family just like, no, we're not answering. Like it.
Yeah, and so then they end up in the Salvation Army rooming house, and like it's
That's the one
uncomfortable.
on. Is it the top of Young or is it? No.
It's the one that used to be up there. Yeah.
Yeah.
This movie, it's quite brief. It's a little under 90 minutes, and a lot of the runtime is devoted to like montages that kind of link together the scenes. So you get like people walking down Young Street, or you'll get these kind of like early morning in the city, or just like folks milling about Allen Gardens, or like the kind of parks in the city that really situate Pete and Joey within the just like comings and goings of the city. But it also creates a kind of like weird rhythm to the film where you expect these little moments to punctuate and like link you to the others. So the actual scenes themselves are like very economical, and obviously this is because of budgetary constraints, but it also creates a very rich cinematic sense of like the scenes are just distilled to their essence. Like they don't overstay their welcome. It's like you get the moment and you get out. And so you get these little scenes of Pete and Joey will go to the bar after. So they end up getting like a job at a beer packing plant, and they just move
I think
bottles.
it's ginger ale.
Oh, ginger ale. But then you get the scene where Pete is explaining how many bottles they've moved. And ends up being like, within the past 4 months, we've ended up moving 500,000 bottles each personally. Yeah. And he's just doing like napkin math. And Joey's just like baffled as to why he's even like worrying about it. But it's just the idea of like, we've moved that much and we haven't moved at all, like us, ourselves, right? But you get scenes like that where it's such a specific moment, right? It's such a specific way of approaching the thing, but it captures something so like universal in the idea of like, I'm not moving anywhere in my life.
Yeah, no, the Sisyphean nature of the dead end job. Like I couldn't, when I was watching this movie, I couldn't help but think back to like when I moved to Toronto, like I was working at like, I had like a seasonal job at the LCBO, which is like the liquor stores in Ontario. And I just remember like this movie is great at capturing that, how you can kind of get into a blur with these sort of, you're just working a whatever job for whatever money, and you just have enough that I can go out and drink some beer. And then the next day you do it again. And like the way the movie captures that reality. And then, in the passage of time, the characters all of a sudden like, oh, it's been a few months. And like they're like, oh, I got nothing saved. And like, it's just really good at capturing like that sort of an experience. And I think the montage adds to that, where it's like, that's almost like the memory of this sort of thing, where it's like, it's repetitive, right? Like it's, so the montage captures the repetitive cyclical aspect of this sort of lifestyle, punctured by those moments, these like scenes we get. And one thing I noticed that Shebib does is like a lot of those scenes where we get something, the scene is like truncated. It doesn't end. And it's like they like say something and you feel like you could go else, like that could be like developed more and more, but then it moves on to the next, which one keeps the pace of this movie. Like, I mean, it's a short movie, but also it moves like really quickly. And then, but it also sort of like, we feel like we're just sort of looking in on these characters. But you get a sense that there's like more going on too, that we don't see. Like, it's not like the world of these characters in Toronto is just confined to whatever is being shown on screen. And I think he handles that through the montage and through the way he creates these short little scenes, creates that feeling, I think.
Absolutely. And it's one of the things that the movie borrows from American indies like Cassavetes and also like French New Wave, which is unlike a lot of independent cinema that you watch nowadays, which seems hermetically sealed. The docudrama approach, the economical approach, actually embeds it within like a comprehensible reality that exists outside of the characters and like blends them in with the real world around them so that everything becomes more believable and recognizable. And thus it actually seems more cinematic because it doesn't seem like it's cutting corners.
Yeah, actually, you know what? Like, that's great because I've sometimes been struck by how like you'll watch like an indie movie of like say the past decade, and it's trying to convey the experience of lived reality. And it often decides to do that, like the modern indie, by having a scene go on longer than normal. And you're sort of like the dialogue, whatever, just sort of stretches out. And so they're almost trying to capture like that reality by extending how much we see on screen beyond what a normal movie does. And like you're right that like this is working, it's using the opposite principle to try to convey that lived reality.
Yeah, it's just it's a really remarkable movie, and you get scenes like the one where so Joey ends up knocking up a waitress played by Jane Eastwood from SCTV, if you ever watched that back in the day, and Bibbs, and he ends up marrying her, and they have this marriage scene at the Legion Hall.
Yeah,
and
the
it's
wedding.
like it's one of the saddest. It's just such a sad scene, and he's kind of a few beers in, and he stands up and he has a drunken speech, and she's like, "No, don't say it." And he's like, "Well, you know, folks, well, yeah, it's what you think. We're gonna have a little family here," and like kind of explains that like they're only getting married because he knocked her up, but he's so earnest in his.
Or he's trying to say that it's because he loves her, and that's
And
not the
would
reason.
be despite exactly, but he's
But by
ultimately
bringing
saying the
attention
opposite.
to it, yeah,
He's saying the opposite, and you just feel so bad. And then this is a case of where the scene isn't truncated. The scene continues a bit, and then you get him asking Pete for the money to cover the beers at the Legion Hall, and Pete's like, "Yeah, buddy, I got some money I can give you." It's just it's a movie with like. I think it's the kind of movie, had I watched it when I was like 18, 19, and I was just kind of curious about historically important films, so-called, I don't think I would appreciate it as much. But when you watch it a little bit further down the road of life, you start to realize all the things that you recognize. And so this, especially nowadays when, we talk about like representation and things like that in movies, and people have this idea where like, well, it's two white guys from the Maritimes. But it's like, forget about their like skin color. That's kind of beside the point. The idea here is they're outsiders to this central city, and that they're on a journey towards it, that they can never actually get the place they're going, much like most people watching the movie.
Yep.
So it's kind of like impossible to not see yourself in these two lovable dimwits who just want a better life.
Yeah, and it's that like it's the combination of like the person coming to the town or like to the city, they're both sort of like put to the outside. There's sort of a marginalized aspect going on. Like they're the ones who are furloughed at the packing place that they work at, so they lose their jobs at one point for a period of time. They're like, "Oh, come back in a few months," but then it's unclear, if they'll come back. So there's definitely a sense that if anyone's going to have to take the short end of the stick, these guys are the ones who are going to have to get it. And then at the same time, there's also a sense that their desires and expectations for the city, they've placed too much on something that like, it's like on one level, the community is excluding these people and marginalizing them. And on the other hand, they're coming in and they have larger expectations and demands from a place that they're like, that they're just new to. And so they have it's the delusions of grandeur, right? Like it captures like the very early on where they're just like, yeah, we're just going to be rolling in the dough. Like all the ladies will love us, like all this sort of stuff. And like just seeing that sort of those pipe dreams, like, hit the pavement is because this movie, I have to say, like without giving away the ending in specifics, I was pretty affected by how dark the ending is. Like I was felt like they're like, it's pretty devastating.
It is. It's for a movie that underplays the dramatic aspects of it. It's a very like tragic film.
Yeah.
In a like true dramatic sense. It's yeah, like basically if you have an interest in Canadian cinema, if you have an interest in independent cinema, if you have an interest in 1970s cinema, if you have an interest in the method acting, if you like the idea of docudramas, if you're just simply interested in working class cinema, like you need to watch Going Down the Road if you haven't. There are copies floating around on YouTube. It's not hard to find a version to watch this movie. Unfortunately, because of the nature of when it was made and nature of Canadian cinema, there's not like many great versions floating around. There's like a Blu-ray with it and its long legacy sequel that Donald Shebib made in 2011. But there was like a minor restoration when TIFF was playing it for a bit in late 2000s, early 2010s, which is when I first saw the movie in theaters at TIFF. So that was like a good introduction to it. But yeah, if it's really a movie that more people need to see. It has its reputation within Canadian circles, but it really needs to have its reputation in just like larger film circles. And it's a movie that I just know if more people watch who are interested in cinema of this period, they'll get a lot out of it. Well, thanks for listening. We'll catch you next time.
Goodbye, Mr. Bond.
I bid you farewell.